Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to a small landlocked patch of the Balkans that spent the better part of 30 years arguing with its neighbour about its own name. Not its borders, not its government, its name. North Macedonia only became North Macedonia in 2019. Before that, for the international community, it was awkwardly known as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, a mouthful so clunky it basically had its own zip code. The dispute was with Greece, which has its own region called Macedonia, and was not thrilled about a neighbouring country claiming the name, along with all the historical baggage that comes attached to it. Baggage like, say, Alexander the Great. We'll get to him, he's got a whole chapter coming. But before we get anywhere near ancient kings and conquered empires, we need to talk about the land itself, because this is a place where the geography basically wrote the history's opening chapters for it. So here's what I want you to do. Dim the lights. Get comfortable, however you like to get comfortable, blanket, pillow, the dog taking up 60% of the bed, whatever your setup is. Tonight isn't about staying sharp. It's about drifting off somewhere new, to the sound of rivers cutting through mountains and a lake older than the concept of lakes having names. If you're new here, welcome, stick around, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's genuinely one of my favourite parts of making these. Now, let's go stand on a mountainside in the middle of the Balkans and look down at a valley that's been a highway for about 4,000 years. Chapter 1. The valley, the lake, and the mountains that made a crossroads. Let's start with the basics, because the basics here are doing a lot of heavy lifting. North Macedonia is landlocked. No coastline, no navy to speak of, no beach vacations advertised on its tourism board. It sits in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula, wedged between 5 countries, Kosovo and Serbia to the north, Bulgaria to the east, Greece to the south, and Albania to the west. The whole country covers a little over 25,000 square kilometres, which puts it in the same size range as a smallish American state, something like Vermont, if Vermont had spent the last 2 million years being violently squeezed and folded by tectonic plates until nearly 3/4 of it turned into mountains. Because that's the other basic fact you need to hold on to tonight. This is not a flat country. This is a country where the land itself seems to be constantly trying to stand up. Picture it from above, the way a bird would see it. Or honestly, the way a very tired Roman road surveyor probably saw it 2,000 years ago and immediately regretted his career choices. Mountain ranges everywhere, folding into each other like crumpled paper, and running right through the middle of all that chaos is a single decisive gash of a valley. That's the Vardar. It's the longest river in the country, stretching a little over 312 kilometres, and it does something the surrounding mountains refuse to do. It makes sense. It rises up in the Shah Mountains in the northwest, gathers itself, and then just commits to a direction, carving a north to south corridor straight through the heart of the country before crossing into Greece and eventually spilling into the Aegean Sea near Thessaloniki. Now here's why that matters, and I promise this isn't just river trivia. If you're an ancient trader, a marching army, a wandering monk, or frankly anyone at all trying to get from Central Europe down to the Mediterranean without personally climbing a mountain range, the Vardar Valley is your best friend. It's part of what's sometimes called the Morava-Vardar corridor, a natural passageway that connects the Danube basin all the way down to the Aegean coast, which means for thousands of years, before anyone had heard of a highway system, this valley basically was one. Everyone who wanted to move goods, armies, ideas, or diseases between Central Europe and the Mediterranean world eventually had to pass through this exact strip of land. It's the reason this small, landlocked, mountain-choked country kept ending up in the middle of everyone else's business. You don't get to be a quiet backwater when you're sitting on the only convenient door between two major regions. Geography, it turns out, is destiny. Or at least it's really, really persistent peer pressure. The capital, Skopje, sits right in this valley, in a broad depression the Vardar carved out over millennia, and it's been an important stopping point for essentially every empire that's ever marched through the region. We'll get into who exactly did that marching in later chapters. For now, just picture the valley itself wide enough for farms and towns to spread out along the riverbanks, flanked on both sides by mountains rising up like the walls of a very long, very green hallway. Further along, near the town of Tito, the river narrows and gets more dramatic, slicing through a gorge before opening up again as it heads south toward the Greek border. It's not a gentle river. It's a working river, and it's been working the same job for longer than most human institutions have existed. Okay, I know I said we'd get to the lake. We're getting to the lake. But first, humour me on the mountains for one more minute, because they're not just scenery, they're basically the entire reason the rest of the geography looks the way it does. The northwest corner of the country is dominated by the Shah Mountains, a serious, no-nonsense range that forms a natural wall along the border with Kosovo. Its highest peak, Tito Vrvi, tops out at around 2,748 metres. Nearby stands Ljubotin, a sharp, almost pyramid-shaped peak that looks like it was designed by someone who really wanted mountains to look more dramatic in photographs. And it works. It's the kind of silhouette that makes you understand instantly why people who live near mountains this size tend to develop strong feelings about them. But the true high point of the entire country isn't in the Shah Range at all. That honour belongs to Mount Korab, sitting on the border with Albania, reaching 2,764 metres into the sky. It's the tallest peak in North Macedonia, and it's also the tallest peak in Albania, since the two countries happen to share it right along the border ridge, which either sounds like a nice bit of geographic cooperation or an argument waiting to happen, depending on your read of Balkan history. Spoiler, we'll see plenty of both later on. Korab looms over a genuinely rugged, remote stretch of terrain, the kind of place where roads are more of a suggestion than a guarantee, and where the border triangle of Albania, Kosovo, and North Macedonia all quietly meet in a knot of peaks that most of the world has simply never heard of. Now, the lake. Let's talk about Lake Ohrid, because this is the part of the geography that genuinely gets scientists excited. And trust me, scientists do not get excited easily. Lake Ohrid sits in the southwest corner of the country, straddling the border with Albania, and it is old. Not old like a Roman ruin. Old like, brace yourself, somewhere between 1 million and 10 million years old, with a lot of researchers converging on a figure of roughly 2 to 3 million years as a working estimate. To put that in perspective, most of the lakes you've ever swum in were carved out by glaciers something like 10 or 20,000 years ago, which in Lake Ohrid's timeline would barely register as last Tuesday. This lake was already ancient before the genus Homo existed. It watched the ice ages come and go the way the rest of us watch seasons change. And here's the wild part, because it's so old, and because it's remained a stable, undisturbed body of water for that entire stretch of geological time, Lake Ohrid became something biologists call a living fossil lake. Species that evolved in there had millions of uninterrupted years to specialize, adapt, and become utterly unique to this one specific body of water. Over 200 species found in Lake Ohrid exist nowhere else on Earth. Not in the next lake over, not in the river that feeds it. Nowhere else, period. That includes several species of trout, the Ohrid trout among them, plus a small ecosystem's worth of endemic snails, sponges and flatworms that evolved in total isolation, like a tiny underwater Galapagos that nobody bothered to put on a coffee mug. The water itself is what's called oligotrophic, meaning it's low in nutrients and startlingly clear, the kind of clear where you can see disturbingly far down into water that plunges to depths of nearly 300 meters. That's deep enough to comfortably submerge most skyscrapers with room to spare, in a lake sitting in the middle of landlocked mountains, which is the sort of detail that should sound made up and isn't. The lake is so significant, in fact, that UNESCO recognised it as a World Heritage Site all the way back in 1979, and it wasn't just for the biology. It was a combined natural and cultural listing, because the town of Ohrid on its shores has its own extraordinary story, one we're going to save for a later chapter, when this place becomes something people started calling a spiritual capital of the region. For now, just sit with the geography. A lake this old, this deep, this biologically singular, sitting quietly in a mountain basin in a country most people couldn't point to on a map. It's the kind of place that makes you wonder what else is hiding in plain sight around the world, just waiting for someone to ask the right question about it. Not far from Ohrid, separated by a rugged limestone ridge called the Galachica Mountains, sits Lake Ohrid's quieter, higher altitude sibling, Lake Prespa. And when I say higher altitude, I mean it. Prespa sits roughly 150 meters above Ohrid, at an elevation of about 850 meters, making it one of the highest tectonic lakes anywhere in the Balkans. It's actually a two-lake system, Great Prespa and Little Prespa, and it does something genuinely unusual for a major lake. It has essentially no river flowing out of it. No dramatic outlet, no waterfall, nothing you could point a camera at and call a river mouth. So where does all that water go? Here's the part that, honestly, blew my mind when I was researching this. The water from Lake Prespa doesn't flow out over the surface at all. It disappears underground. The Galachica ridge between the two lakes is made of porous limestone, riddled with cracks and channels carved out over millennia. Geologists call this karst terrain, and Prespa's water seeps directly into that rock, filtering slowly through the mountain for what researchers estimate can take years, before re-emerging as fresh springs along the shoreline of Lake Ohrid. The mountain itself is functioning as a natural water treatment plant, quietly filtering out sediment and a huge portion of the phosphorus that would otherwise pollute Ohrid's famously clear water, and it's been doing this job, invisibly, for longer than any human filtration system has existed by a margin of, a few million years. Two lakes, connected not by a river you can see, but by an entire mountain acting as plumbing. Nature had an infrastructure plan here millennia before anyone was handing out engineering degrees. Lake Prespa itself is a genuine geographic oddity. In another way too, it's a literal tri-point lake, its waters lapping up against North Macedonia, Albania and Greece all at once, with the majority of the lake, roughly 2/3, sitting on the North Macedonian side. Picture standing on its shore and realizing that a short boat ride in 3 different directions puts you in 3 different countries, each with its own language, its own currency, its own version of history about who this land actually belongs to. It's the kind of place where borders feel almost beside the point, because the water obviously never got the memo that it was supposed to stay in one country. Zoom out from the lakes now and take in the climate, because it's not uniform across this small, vertically ambitious country. It shifts dramatically depending on where you're standing. Down in the Vardar Valley and the lower basins, summers are properly hot, the kind of hot where temperatures regularly climb past 35 degrees Celsius in July and August, dry and relentless, with a distinctly Mediterranean flavour blowing up faintly from the Aegean. Winters down there are milder, colder than a beach town but nothing brutal. Head up into the Shah Mountains or over toward Korab though, and you're in an entirely different climate zone, properly continental, with genuinely harsh winters, heavy snowfall that can bury mountain villages for months, and summers that stay cool and short by comparison. Rainfall follows the same pattern of contrast. The dry eastern valleys might see around 500 millimeters of precipitation a year, while the wetter western mountains, catching moisture rolling in off the Adriatic side of the Balkans, can see well over 1,000. So depending on where you are in the country, you might be sweating through a Mediterranean summer or shoveling snow off a mountain cabin roof, sometimes on the same afternoon in different parts of the country. It's not a big place. It just contains an unreasonable number of different weather systems for its size. All of this, the valley, the lake, the mountains, the karst-filtered plumbing between two ancient bodies of water adds up to more than pretty scenery. It's the reason this particular stretch of the Balkans became a crossroads instead of a cul-de-sac, a river corridor that practically begs to be travelled. A mountain wall that funnels every army and every trade route into that same narrow valley. A lake so old and so pure that people would eventually look at it and see something sacred rather than just scenic. The land basically set the stage before a single human civilization showed up to read their lines. And they did show up, plenty of them actually, starting with a people whose name still echoes in the region today, and a kingdom that would eventually produce one of the most famous conquerors history has ever recorded. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, just picture the valley at dusk, the mountains going purple at the edges, and a lake so still and so old it barely seems to notice the passage of time at all. Chapter 2. The Kingdom Before the Kingdom. So here's who showed up first, or at least first enough that we actually have names for them. Long before anyone had heard of Alexander or Philip or a kingdom called Macedon at all, the Vardar Valley was already home to a people called the Paeonians. They'd been farming the river terraces and working the hill country since at least the early Iron Age, minding their own business in the way ancient tribes do, right up until someone writes a story about them, and someone did. Homer mentions the Paeonians in the Iliad, fighting on the Trojan side, which means this valley had a walk-on role in Western literature's founding blockbuster, a solid 2,500 years before anyone here had heard of Skopje, let alone North Macedonia. Not bad for a footnote. The Paeonians weren't quite Greek, weren't quite Illyrian, and weren't quite Thracian either. They were their own thing, sitting right in the middle of the crossroads geography we spent all of last chapter admiring, which meant influence, trade, and the occasional invasion from every direction at once. By the 6th century BCE, the Paeonians had done something that tends to separate a tribe from a proper kingdom in the eyes of ancient historians. They started minting their own coins. Silver tetradrachms, their own designs, traded across the region, which doesn't sound revolutionary until you remember that coinage back then was basically a nation's business card, a way of announcing to everyone nearby that you were a serious operation and not just a loose crowd of guys with spears. They had kings too, a whole roster of them across the centuries. Agis, Lycpeos, Patraos, Ordolion, Leon, Dropion, names that mostly survive now on museum placards, but real rulers of a real kingdom. By the 3rd century BCE, the Paeonians had even organized themselves into a koinon, a kind of league modelled loosely on Greek political institutions, while still keeping a king around, a bit like bolting a parliament onto a monarchy and hoping nobody asks too many questions about the wiring. Now, here's where we need to be careful, because this detail is going to matter enormously later in this series, like entire diplomatic crisis levels of later. Ancient Macedon, the kingdom of Philip and Alexander, the one you've actually heard of, was not centred here. Its heartland sat further south, around the cities of Aigai and Pella, territory that today belongs to Greece. What's now North Macedonia was, for most of its early history, Paeonian land, a neighbouring, related, but distinct kingdom that Macedon would eventually conquer and absorb. So the relationship between this region and the Alexander the Great kingdom you're picturing right now is real and it's important. But it isn't a simple case of this was ancient Macedon. It's closer to this was Macedon's northern frontier, then its northern province, then, many centuries later, its namesake. And that gap between being part of something and being the heart of it is going to become a very long argument. We'll get there. For now, just remember, two kingdoms, related but separate, about to collide. The collision starts with Philip II, and if you want a masterclass in inheriting a total disaster and somehow coming out ahead, this is it. Philip took the Macedonian throne in 359 BCE under close to the worst circumstances imaginable. His brother, King Perdiccas III, had just been killed fighting off an Illyrian invasion, along with roughly 4,000 Macedonian soldiers, which is the ancient equivalent of losing your CEO and half your workforce in one afternoon. While the kingdom reeled, the Paeonians and the Thracians smelled blood and started raiding Macedonia's eastern territories, and just to round things out, the Athenians landed troops on the coast backing a rival claimant to the throne. Philip, 23 years old and suddenly in charge of a kingdom actively on fire, did the only sensible thing available to him. He paid the Paeonians and the Thracians to go home. Bribery first, war later, a strategy that has aged better than most 23-year-olds' decision-making tends to. War arrived soon enough. Once Philip had bought himself some breathing room and dealt with the Athenian-backed pretender, defeating 3,000 Athenian hoplites outright, he turned to actually rebuilding his army rather than just surviving with it. This is the stretch where Philip started assembling the force that would eventually conquer half the known world longer spears called sarissas, tighter formations, real discipline. Then, in 358 BCE, timing his move the moment the Paeonian king Agis died, because nothing says opportunity like a rival kingdom's succession crisis, Philip marched north with roughly 10,000 men. The new Paeonian king, Lippius, met him in open battle and lost, badly enough that the Paeonians were forced to swear allegiance to Macedon on the spot. Not annexation exactly, not yet. More like a hostile takeover where the old management technically keeps their office, but suddenly answers to someone new. That not yet is worth sitting with, because Macedonian control over Paeonia wasn't one dramatic conquest. It was a slow squeeze that played out over generations. Take the city of Stobi, sitting exactly where the Kurna River meets the Vardar, a Paeonian settlement since the Archaic period, and frankly, prime real estate, with good soil, a river junction, and marble in the nearby hills. Stobi didn't get formally folded into the Macedonian kingdom until 200 BCE, under a much later king, Philip V, more than a century and a half after Philip II first humbled the Paeonians on the battlefield. So picture Paeonia's absorption, less like a light switch flipping and more like a dimmer, turning slowly, decade after decade, until eventually nobody could quite remember when the lights of Paeonian independence had actually gone out. Meanwhile, in 336 BCE, Philip's son took over, and you know roughly how this story goes. Alexander III, Alexander the Great, spent the next 13 years conquering essentially everything between Greece and India, And here's the detail that ties this valley directly into that legend. The newly subdued Paeonians didn't just sit out Alexander's wars, they rode in them. Alexander kept a unit of Paeonian light cavalry, commanded by a Paeonian nobleman named Ariston, whose loyalty to Macedon apparently ran deep enough that his countrymen stayed quiet while he was off conquering Persia alongside the boss. The unit started as a single squadron and grew, 500 more riders joining in Egypt, another 600 at Susa, until by the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the Paeonians were a serious force on Alexander's right flank. Ariston himself killed the Persian commander Satrapates in single combat and presented Alexander with the severed head, which is either the most old-school performance review in history or a genuinely alarming way to ask for a raise. Then, in 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon at 32 years old, having conquered an empire so vast that nobody, including apparently Alexander, had worked out what to do with it afterward. Asked on his deathbed who should inherit the kingdom, he's said to have answered to the strongest, which is either profound or the single worst piece of estate planning in recorded history. Probably both. His generals, a group historians politely call the Diadochi Greek for successors, though a small army of men fighting over the furniture, would also work spent the next 4 decades carving the empire into rival kingdoms, occasionally murdering each other's families to make the point stick. It was, to put it mildly, a mess. And somewhere in the middle of that mess, back home, Macedon itself, including its northern Paeonian territories, badly needed new management. That management eventually became the Antigonid dynasty, founded properly by Antigonus II, nicknamed Gonatas, who secured the Macedonian throne around 277 BCE after decades of chaos that had included Celtic invasions and multiple short-lived rival kings. Under the Antigonids, Macedon settled into something resembling stability for the first time in a while, and Paeonia, by then thoroughly a Macedonian territory rather than an independent kingdom, settled along with it. The Antigonids ruled Macedon, this Vardar Valley region included, for roughly a century and a half, producing kings with names like Antigonus Doson and Philip V, the same Philip who finally absorbed Stobi in 200 BCE. It was, relatively speaking, the calm chapter within the chapter. It would not last, because a new power was rising in the west, and it had a habit of not staying there. That power was Rome, and Rome's relationship with Macedon can be summed up as 4 wars over roughly 70 years, each one going worse for Macedon than the last. The early rounds are mostly skippable, lots of posturing, little resolved, but the second war landed a real blow. In 197 BCE, at an unremarkable stretch of hills called Cynoscephalae, Roman legions defeated Philip V's army and exposed a genuine weakness. The legendary Macedonian phalanx, that wall of soldiers bristling with sarissas, was terrifying, head-on but disastrous on uneven ground, where its rigid formation couldn't adapt fast enough to Roman flexibility. Philip survived as a Roman client king, humbled but alive, which in ancient geopolitics counts as a genuinely good outcome. His son, Perseus, would not be nearly so fortunate. Perseus took the throne in 179 BCE, and unlike his father, had no interest in playing nice with Rome, which led straight into the Third Macedonian War in 171 BCE. It ended on the 22nd of June, 168 BCE, at a place called Pydna, in one of the more decisive afternoons in ancient military history. The Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus faced Perseus's army, and the same old flaw reappeared. The phalanx, magnificent on flat ground, broke apart the moment the terrain got uneven, and Roman legionaries, smaller units, far more manoeuvrable, poured through the gaps. It wasn't really a battle so much as a collapse. Perseus's army was annihilated. Perseus himself was captured and paraded through Rome in chains, and the Antigonid dynasty, ruling since not long after Alexander's death, ended that day permanently. Rome's handling of a conquered kingdom was, in 168 BCE, surprisingly restrained by ancient standards. No mass enslavement, no city burned to the ground. Instead, Macedon was carved into 4 separate client republics, each paying tribute to Rome but otherwise left to govern itself, an arrangement that lasted about as long as those always do. Worth noting, this was also the exact year Rome's forces took Stobi, that Paeonian turned Macedonian river town, closing a loop that had opened centuries earlier with an independent Paeonian settlement. The dimmer switch had finally clicked off. 20 years later, in 146 BCE, after a final failed uprising, sometimes called the Fourth Macedonian War, Rome stopped pretending the client republic experiment was working and simply annexed the whole region outright, folding it into a new Roman province named, appropriately enough, Macedonia. And it's right here that the corridor we spent all of last chapter admiring, the Vardar Valley, that ancient north-south highway carved by geology long before anyone needed it, got a partner. Starting around 146 BCE, Roman engineers began building the Via Egnatia, a road that would eventually stretch over 1,100 kilometers from the Adriatic coast to Byzantium, the city that would later become Constantinople, and later still, Istanbul. The Via Egnatia ran west to east, the Vardar corridor ran north to south, and where the two crossed, down near modern Bitola, at a Roman settlement called Heraclea Lyncestis, this territory stopped being a frontier and became something far more valuable, a junction. 2 of the ancient world's great arteries met almost on top of each other here, which is most of the answer to why so many empires kept bothering to fight over this particular patch of the Balkans. So by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the story of this valley had quietly flipped. It started the chapter as Paeonian land, independent, coin minting, with its own kings and its own version of events. It ends the chapter as a Roman province, crisscrossed by imperial roads, garrisoned, taxed, and thoroughly wired into the largest political machine the ancient world had ever built. Stobi would go on to become a genuinely important Roman city, its story nowhere near finished, but that's a detail for later, because Rome, it turns out, was only the beginning of a very long queue of empires with opinions about who should run this crossroads. Rome's peace held here for centuries, and when it finally started to crack, what came through wasn't another army from the south. It was something new, moving in from the north and the east, and it would end up reshaping the language, the religion, and the entire identity of this land more than Paeonians, Macedonians, or Romans ever had. But that's genuinely a story for next time. Chapter 3. The Alphabet That Outlived the Empire. So, something new, moving in from the north and east. Here's what that something actually was, and it starts, weirdly enough, with a plague. Back in the 1540s, an outbreak now known as the Plague of Justinian tore through the Eastern Roman world so thoroughly that entire provinces simply emptied out. And a hollowed-out Balkans is a Balkans that can't hold a border anymore. Rome's garrisons thinned, its tax collectors had fewer people to collect from, and into that vacuum, over the following 2 centuries, came waves of Slavic-speaking peoples drifting down out of the lands north of the Danube, following the same river corridors that traders and legions had used for 1,000 years because good geography doesn't care who's using it. By the middle of the 6th century, they were crossing into Roman territory in real numbers. By the early 7th, they were staying. They didn't so much conquer this valley as quietly move into it. One group in particular, a tribe called the Burziti, settled the upper Vardar, the shores of Lake Ohrid, and the plain around what's now Bitola, setting up loose, self-governing communities that Byzantine writers lumped together under a wonderfully utilitarian label Sclavinii, which translates to roughly Slav lands, the kind of name you give something when you can't be bothered to learn its actual name yet. Constantinople was still nominally in charge. In practice, the emperor was fighting wars on about 4 other fronts at once and simply didn't have the spare army to evict several 100,000 new arrivals. So Byzantium did what exhausted empires often do. It stopped fighting the tide and started trying to convert it instead. That's the strategy, by the way, that actually worked. Byzantine Christianity had already been quietly leaking into the region for generations. Monks and missionaries drifting through the Vardar corridor the same way everyone else did. But the effort that actually changed the course of history arrived in the year 863, and it didn't start here at all. It started in Great Moravia, up around the modern Czech Republic, where a prince named Rastislav wanted his own Slavic-speaking clergy instead of Frankish priests, answering to German bishops, a medieval version of wanting your own IT department instead of outsourcing to the guys who keep upselling you. Rastislav asked Constantinople for help. Constantinople sent 2 brothers from Thessaloniki, a city close enough to this valley that you could functionally call them locals. Their names were Cyril and Methodius, and they were about to invent something that would outlast every empire in this story. Cyril's actual contribution, before anyone had heard the word Cyrillic, was inventing an entirely new alphabet from scratch, called Glagolitic, specifically so Slavic-speaking congregations could read scripture in their own language instead of Latin or Greek. Try to appreciate how strange that was at the time. This wasn't translating a book. This was building the typewriter first. The brothers spent 4 years in Moravia, translating liturgy, training priests, and generally trying to give an oral culture a functioning written one, and it went about as well as you'd expect for 2 Byzantine Greeks setting up shop in Frankish territory, which is to say, the local German clergy hated it. There was an actual theological argument at the time that only Latin, Greek and Hebrew were fit languages for worship, sometimes called the trilingual heresy dispute, which is a genuinely wild thing to have gone to church committee meetings about. Methodius held the mission together for a while after Cyril died in Rome in 869, but when Methodius himself died in 885, the Frankish bishops moved fast. Their disciples were arrested, expelled, or sold into slavery, and the whole Moravian mission collapsed within about a year, which sounds like the end of the story. It was actually the beginning of the interesting part, because a handful of those disciples didn't go home defeated, they went south, toward a kingdom that was already Christian, already Slavic-speaking, and already very interested in having its own literate clergy instead of importing Greek ones. That kingdom was Bulgaria, and 2 of those refugee scholars, a pair named Clement and Naum, kept walking until they reached the shores of a lake we already spent an entire chapter admiring. And here it is. Remember Lake Ohrid, that impossibly old, impossibly clear body of water we called a spiritual capital of the region and told you to sit with for later? This is later. Clement arrived around 886 with the backing of the Bulgarian ruler Boris I, and instead of just building a church, he built something closer to a university. Historians call it the Ohrid Literary School, and by most estimates, it eventually trained somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 students in reading, writing, translation, and liturgy, an almost absurd number of scholars to be producing out of a lakeside town most of Europe had never heard of. Naum worked alongside him, and when Clement was elevated to bishop in 893, Naum simply took over running the place, because apparently succession planning was the one thing this region occasionally got right. Here's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. Around this same period, scholars working in Bulgaria, likely in this exact circle, though historians still argue over precisely where refined Cyril's clunky, ornate glagolitic letters into a simpler script based more directly on the Greek alphabet, and in a fairly touching bit of credit where due, they named it Cyrillic after a man who'd technically never used it himself. That script, workshopped and taught right here on the shores of Lake Ohrid, is the same basic alphabet that, centuries later, would end up printing Russian novels, Serbian road signs, and Bulgarian menus from the Baltic to the Pacific. An empire that once felt like a distant, unrelated footnote to this valley Kievan Rus, not even founded yet, would eventually run its entire written culture on letters shaped in a monastery, a short walk from where you're picturing right now. Ohrid didn't just earn the nickname spiritual capital, it quietly became a printing press for half a continent, several centuries before printing presses existed. While Clement and Naum were busy building a school, Bulgaria itself was busy becoming a serious power. Boris I had converted the kingdom to Christianity back in 864, and his son Simeon pushed it into what's still remembered as a golden age, expanding Bulgarian territory deep into this region and treating Byzantium less like a neighbour and more like a rival empire. It didn't last. By 971, a sharp, aggressive Byzantine emperor named John I Tzimiskes had smashed the eastern Bulgarian capital at Preslav and effectively decapitated the state, which should have been the end of Bulgaria as an independent power. Instead, out in the western reaches of the collapsing kingdom, this exact valley and its surrounding highlands, four brothers, remembered by historians as the Komatopuli, refused to accept that the story was over. One of those brothers was named Samuil, and by the 990s he'd outmaneuvered or outlived the other three and become sole ruler of what historians now call the Western Bulgarian Empire, or simply Samuil's Empire. And where did he put his capital? Ohrid. Obviously Ohrid. The place was already the region's spiritual and intellectual centre, already home to a functioning church hierarchy and a century of literary infrastructure, so setting up a throne there was less a bold new choice, and more just recognising what the town had already become. Samuil revived the Bulgarian Patriarchate, built himself a fortress on the hill above the lake that still stands today, and started expanding aggressively in every direction north into Serbia, west into the Adriatic coast, south into Thessaly and Epirus, until his empire briefly stretched from the Danube to the Gulf of Corinth. Standing in his way was a young Byzantine emperor named Basil II, and their early encounters did not go well for Basil. In 986, Basil personally led an invasion force into Bulgarian territory and got ambushed at a mountain pass called the Gates of Trajan, near modern Sofia, in a rout so total the emperor himself barely escaped with his life. For a 28-year-old ruler trying to establish his authority, that's less a military setback and more a public humiliation with witnesses. Most rulers would have taken the hint. Basil instead spent the next 28 years, nearly 3 decades, on and off, in between other wars grinding Samuil's empire down piece by piece, campaign after campaign, fortress after fortress, with the sort of grim, patient persistence usually reserved for people with a personal grudge and unlimited resources, because, as it turns out, he had both. It all came down to a mountain pass near the Belasitsa range on the 29th of July. in the year 1014, Samuil's army tried to make a stand at a narrow defile called Ilinden. The name literally means the key, betting that Basil's forces couldn't force their way through. A Byzantine flanking column found a way around anyway, and Samuil's army was annihilated. What happened next is one of those historical footnotes so grim it's circulated through the medieval world like a horror story, because that's essentially what it was. Basil had roughly 14 to 15,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded, in batches, on the spot, and, in what might be the single cruelest bit of medieval mercy on record, he left one man in every 100 with a single working eye, specifically so he could lead the other 99 home. Try to actually picture that column walking, 99 blind men to everyone who could see, strung together across the mountain roads of the Western Balkans, walking for days back toward Ohrid, back toward the man who'd raised them into an army. When they finally reached Samuil and he understood what he was looking at, the shock reportedly stopped his heart on the spot. He collapsed and died 2 days later, on the 6th of October, 1014. Basil earned a nickname that history simply never let go of, Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer, and it's still how most textbooks introduce him today. Samuil's empire didn't survive him by much. His successors squabbled, defected, or surrendered outright, and by 1018, the entire western Bulgarian state, Ohrid included, had been formally absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. So that was a rough autumn. And yet, and this matters, Ohrid's church survived the political collapse almost entirely intact. Basil, not a sentimental man by any measure, chose to preserve the Archbishopric of Ohrid rather than dissolve it, downgrading its status but keeping its structure, its clergy, and crucially its Slavic liturgical tradition running uninterrupted. The empire that had built the throne was gone. The literary school that had built the alphabet was still standing. For the next 3 centuries, this valley cycled back into familiar territory, Byzantine governors, occasional Bulgarian resurgence, brief flickers of local rebellion, until a new regional power started pushing down from the north. By the early 1300s, Serbian rulers, particularly a king named Stefan Milutin, were steadily annexing this territory, and Milutin's ambitious descendant was about to turn steady annexation into outright empire. That descendant was Stefan Dušan, and on Easter Sunday, the 16th of April, in the year 1346, he stood in Skopje, this valley's own capital city, remember and had himself crowned emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, elevating the Serbian church to a full patriarchate in the same ceremony for good measure. At its height, Dušan's empire stretched from the Danube down to the Gulf of Corinth, and from the Adriatic coast east to the Aegean and the Maritsa River, arguably the largest, most powerful state the medieval Balkans ever produced. It didn't outlive him. Dušan died suddenly in 1355, only middle-aged, and without the one thing every medieval empire actually needs to survive its founder, a strong heir. His son inherited a throne. He did not inherit the empire that came with it. The unravelling was fast and it was ugly. Regional lords who'd sworn loyalty to Dušan started acting like independent rulers the moment he was gone, and the fatal blow landed on the 26th of September, 1371, at the Battle of Maritsa, where an Ottoman force crushed a Serbian army led by 2 of those regional lords, killing both of them outright. The last titular Serbian emperor died within weeks of the news reaching him, and with no one left to hold the centre, the empire simply stopped existing as a single thing. In its place, a patchwork of competing local lords, one of them, a young nobleman named Marko, left holding a modest domain centred on the town of Prilep. Right back in this same valley, an Ottoman vassal ruling the wreckage of an empire. in a region about to meet the power that would run it for the next 500 years. Chapter 4. 5 centuries under the Crescent, and the Republic that lasted 10 days. So the Serbian Empire is gone, the valley is up for grabs, and a young nobleman named Marko is sitting in Prilep with a title, a modest domain, and a boss he never asked for. That boss is the Ottoman Sultan, and over the next few decades the Sultan's armies finish the job Maritza started, methodically swallowing up whatever independence was left in the region. Bitola falls sometime in the early 1380s. Skopje falls in 1392, taken by an Ottoman commander named Pasha Yiğit Bey, who then more or less sets up shop there. Piece by piece, town by town, the map gets redrawn. And the local lords who are smart enough to read the room Marko very much included don't fight it. They bend the knee, keep their little territories, and become vassals, which sounds humiliating when you say it like that, and, well, it kind of was. Here's the part of the Marko story that folk ballads conveniently leave out. In Serbian and Macedonian epic poetry, King Marko becomes a superhero, supernatural strength, a flying horse, single-handedly holding back the Ottoman tide. The reality is almost the exact opposite, and it's a genuinely great piece of historical irony. Marko died on the 17th of May, 1395, at the Battle of Rovine, fighting in Wallachia, and he wasn't fighting the Ottomans. He was fighting for them, as part of Sultan Bayezid's army, against a Wallachian prince named Mircea the Elder. The legendary defender of his people died as somebody else's conscript, on somebody else's campaign, for a cause that had nothing to do with him. It's the historical equivalent of the action hero in the movie poster actually spending the whole film running errands for the villain. Legends are written later. Vassals just show up when they're told to. With Marko gone, and the last pockets of local resistance mopped up over the following decades, the conquest is essentially complete by the early 1400s. And here's where you need to reset your sense of scale, because what's about to happen isn't a chapter, it's practically the whole book. The Ottomans are going to run this region for roughly 500 years. 500 years is longer than the United States has existed, twice over. It's longer than the gap between Shakespeare and right now. Entire language shifts, entire religions, entire ways of organising a society are going to rise, calcify, and eventually crack all under the same flag. So take a breath, because we're not rushing through this part. This is the long middle of the story, and it's where most of what makes this region look the way it does today actually gets built. The first thing to understand about Ottoman rule is that it wasn't organised the way you'd expect. No ministries of Macedonians or Bulgarians or Serbs. The empire ran on something called the millet system, which sorted people by religion, not ethnicity or language. You were part of the Muslim millet, or the Orthodox Christian millet, or the Jewish millet, and each of those communities got a fair amount of self-governance, their own courts, their own religious leaders handling internal disputes, their own tax collection through their own hierarchy. It's a bit like the empire outsourced middle management to the churches and synagogues and let them handle the paperwork. The catch, obviously, was that non-Muslims paid an extra tax for the privilege, called the jizya, and Muslims got first crack at land, office and military opportunity. Equal it was not. But it was also, strange as this sounds, a system built to let a wildly diverse population coexist without anyone trying to make everyone the same, mostly. And that tax situation is exactly why, over the following decades, a portion of the local Slavic Christian population converts to Islam. This wasn't the empire kicking down doors with a sword in one hand and a Quran in the other. It was slower and far more pragmatic than that. Convert, and the jizya disappears. Convert, and you're suddenly eligible for a timar, a land grant handed out in exchange for cavalry service, which is basically a promotion. Convert, and your sons have a shot at real advancement instead of a ceiling. So villages in Western Macedonia, especially around the Reka region, gradually produced a population that stayed Slavic-speaking, kept plenty of local custom, but was now Muslim by faith, a group later known, sometimes affectionately and sometimes not, as the Torbeshi. It's a reminder that religious conversion in the Ottoman world was rarely about belief alone. It was often, quite bluntly, a tax strategy with eternal consequences. Layer that on top of everything else moving through this valley for 5 centuries, and you get one of the most genuinely mixed populations anywhere in Europe. Slavic-speaking Orthodox Christians, still the majority in most areas. Slavic-speaking Muslims like the Torbeshi, ethnic Turks, some descended from soldiers and administrators, some from settlers who just never left. Albanians, arriving from the west, many converting to Islam over time, many staying Catholic or Orthodox. Vlachs, Aromanian-speaking shepherds and traders who'd wander whole flocks between mountain pastures and had a knack for turning up wealthy in market towns. Picture the bazaar in Skopje or Bitola on a Thursday. 5 or 6 languages overlapping in one square, the muezzins' call drifting over church bells that are somehow, against all logic, ringing at the same time, a Vlach trader haggling in 3 languages before breakfast. It's not diversity as a modern talking point. It's just what Tuesday looked like. Now, the group that arguably left the deepest cultural fingerprint arrived from somewhere you wouldn't expect Spain. In 1492, the Spanish crown expelled its entire Jewish population, and 4 years later Portugal did the same. The Ottoman Empire, to its considerable credit, said, "Come on in." Sephardic Jewish communities settled across the Balkans, and Bitola, known then by its Ottoman name, Monastir, became one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish centres in the region, alongside Skopje and Štip. By the early 1900s, Monastir's Jewish community numbered over 10,000 people, worshipping in synagogues literally named Aragon and Portugal, as if the buildings themselves refused to forget where they'd come from. They spoke Ladino, a kind of medieval Spanish preserved in amber for 400 years, still muttering old Castilian curse words in the middle of the Balkans while the rest of Spain had moved on to entirely different insults. Administratively, the region mattered a lot. It sat inside the Rumelia Eyalet, the Ottoman Empire's core European territory, and later got carved into provinces with names you'll want to remember for a second. The Vilayet of Kosovo, governed from Skopje starting in the late 1880s, and the Vilayet of Monastir, centred on Bitola from 1874 onward. These weren't backwaters. Skopje and Bitola sat along the old road network running down the Vardar Valley, the same corridor that had carried Roman legions, Slavic migrants, and Byzantine armies for 1,000 years before the Ottomans ever showed up, and it kept doing exactly the same job under new management. Caravans, garrisons, tax collectors, and the occasional sultan's official passed through constantly. If you wanted to move an army, or a shipment of goods, or an idea between Central Europe and the Aegean, you went through this valley. It had been prime real estate since antiquity. The Ottomans just kept the lease going. Life for the average peasant in all this was, unsurprisingly, mostly about survival, and not the dramatic kind. You farmed. You paid your taxes, in cash or in kind, depending on the decade and how efficiently the local tax farmer felt like extracting it. If you were a sipahi, a cavalryman holding a timar grant, your income came directly off the peasants working that land, which created a somewhat lopsided incentive structure, to put it gently. There were long stretches of genuine stability, where villages just got on with things for generations. And there were periods of real hardship, bad harvests, heavier taxation, the occasional bandit gang, known as haiduks, who operated in the mountains robbing travellers and, in local folklore at least, occasionally the rich to help the poor. No hospitals, no representation, no say in who ran the province. Just the rhythm of planting, harvest, and hoping this year's tax collector wasn't feeling ambitious. For the first few centuries, the empire could absorb all of this without much strain. By the 1800s, it couldn't. The central government in Istanbul was losing its grip. Corrupt local officials, called ayans, carved out semi-independent power bases. Tax revenue leaked everywhere except where it was supposed to go, and the empire that once terrified European capitals became, in the words of a Russian Tsar around this period, the sick man of Europe, which is a wonderfully polite 19th century way of saying the patient is dying and everyone's already arguing over the furniture. And in the Balkans specifically, that furniture argument had a name, the Eastern Question. Essentially decades of European powers, politely and sometimes not so politely scheming over who'd get which piece once the Ottomans finally let go. Macedonia, sitting right in the geographic middle of the whole mess, was about to become one of the most fought-over pieces of furniture in the entire room. The scheming turned concrete in 1878. Russia had just beaten the Ottomans in a war, and the resulting Treaty of San Stefano created a massive new Bulgarian state that swallowed almost all of Macedonia whole. Western Europe took one look at a giant pro-Russian Bulgaria sprawled across the Balkans and collectively panicked, so the Congress of Berlin tore the treaty up and handed most of Macedonia straight back to Ottoman control, which solved absolutely nothing. It just created a grudge. Bulgarians spent the next several decades treating San Stefano, Bulgaria, as the country's rightful stolen shape, a kind of national phantom limb. And this is exactly when the church stopped being just a church and became a battlefield. The Bulgarian Exarchate, split off from the Greek Patriarchate in 1870, competed furiously with Greek and later Serbian church networks for the loyalty of Macedonia's Slavic Christians, funding rival schools, appointing rival bishops, essentially fighting a culture war one village congregation at a time. Out of that pressure cooker Ottoman decline, church rivalry, competing national propaganda from three directions at once came something new. People in Macedonia who were tired of being everybody else's argument. In 1893, in Thessaloniki, a small group of revolutionaries founded the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO for short, led by figures like Damjan Gruev and Gotsi Delchev. Their slogan, roughly translated, was Macedonia for the Macedonians, a genuinely radical idea in a region where three neighbouring nations were all busy insisting Macedonia was actually theirs. IMRO organised underground, in secret cells, smuggling weapons and printing manifestos, building towards something bigger than another quiet grievance passed down at church. They weren't interested in swapping one distant capital's rule for another's. They wanted out entirely. It was ambitious, it was dangerous, and within a decade it was going to explode into the open. It exploded on the 2nd of August, 1903 Ilinden St. Elijah's Day, when IMRO launched a coordinated uprising across the Bitola Vilayet, with a second wave following later that month on the Feast of the Transfiguration. In the town of Kruševo, the rebels didn't just fight, they governed. They proclaimed the Kruševo Republic, installed a schoolteacher named Nikola Karev as president, and briefly ran an actual functioning local government, drafting a manifesto that promised equal rights regardless of religion or ethnicity. It lasted 10 days. The Ottoman army, vastly better equipped and simply larger, crushed it by the 12th of August, burning villages and killing indiscriminately as it went, driving roughly 30,000 people to flee as refugees into Bulgaria. As a military campaign, it was a complete failure. As a symbol, it became immortal. Ilinden Day is still one of the most important national holidays in North Macedonia today, more than a century later, precisely because for 10 days, however briefly, people here governed themselves. The Ottomans didn't get to enjoy their victory for long. In 1912, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro formed the Balkan League and jointly drove the Ottoman Empire almost entirely out of Europe in the First Balkan War, 5 centuries of rule collapsing in a matter of months. And then, almost immediately, the winners turned on each other over how to split Macedonia, and the Second Balkan War broke out in 1913, with Serbia, Greece, Romania, and even the battered Ottomans ganging up on Bulgaria this time. The Treaty of Bucharest, signed that August, carved Macedonia 3 ways. Greece took the south, Bulgaria got a small sliver in the east, and Serbia claimed the largest share, the northern and central territory that would become known as Vardar Macedonia, roughly the borders of the country we're following today. So after all of it, the uprising, the republic, the 10 days of self-rule, the region didn't get independence. It got a new landlord, and this one flew a Serbian flag. Chapter 5. A new landlord, a vanished community, and a country that finally got a name. So, new landlord, Serbian flag. Let's see what that actually meant on the ground. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would rename itself Yugoslavia in 1929, presumably because someone finally looked at that mouthful on a passport stamp and had a moment of clarity carved up Vardar Macedonia into something called the Vardar Banovina. And the first thing the new administration did was decide that the Macedonian Slavs living there simply did not exist. Not as a separate people anyway. Officially, they were South Serbs. Just Serbs who'd wandered a bit too far south and picked up a funny accent. The Macedonian language was banned in schools and churches. The word Macedonian itself, as an ethnic label, was banned. Imagine being told by the government that now owns your town that your grandmother's language is not a language, it is a regional inconvenience, and could you please stop speaking it in front of the inspector? This was not a light touch. Belgrade stationed around 50,000 soldiers and gendarmes across a region that, by any reasonable measure, did not need 50,000 soldiers and gendarmes to keep the peace, unless, of course, the peace you're keeping is a peace nobody local actually agreed to. On top of the garrison came colonization. Close to 4,200 Serbian families were resettled onto Macedonian land through the 1930s, a deliberate demographic thumb on the scale. Surnames got quietly Serbianized at the registry office. Priests trained in the Bulgarian exarchate tradition were pushed out and replaced. It was assimilation as government policy, filed and stamped and enforced by men with rifles, and if that sounds exhausting, that's because it was for about 2 decades running. Meanwhile, up in the hills, IMRO, the same internal Macedonian revolutionary organization that had staged the Ilinden Uprising back in 1903, with genuine, if doomed, revolutionary idealism had curdled into something considerably uglier. Based across the border in Bulgaria, largely around the town of Petric, it had essentially become a heavily armed statelet within a state, extorting locals, running protection rackets, feuding between rival factions who settled disagreements the way you'd expect an organization that specializes in bombs and rifles to settle disagreements. A revolutionary movement had become more or less a very well-organized gang with a flag. Bulgaria eventually had to send in its own army to shut down Petric in 1934, which tells you roughly how far things had drifted from Macedonia for the Macedonians. But Imro had one more headline act left, and it was a big one. On the 9th of October, 1934, King Alexander I of Yugoslavia arrived in Marseille to begin a state visit to France, riding through the streets in an open car, waving at crowds the way monarchs do, right up until the moment it goes catastrophically wrong. A gunman named Vlado Chernozemski, an IMRO operative who'd also spent time training Croatian Ustaše fighters, because 1930s European extremism was nothing if not a networking opportunity, stepped out of the crowd and opened fire. He killed the king almost instantly. The French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou, standing nearby, was also killed, apparently by a stray police bullet fired in the chaos that followed, which is its own small, grim irony. Being shot by the people meant to be protecting you. The whole thing was captured on newsreel film, making it one of the very first political assassinations the public could actually watch, again and again, in cinemas. Chernozemski himself didn't survive the afternoon cut down by a mounted officer's sword and then, depending on which account you read, beaten by the crowd or shot by police or both. So the man who killed a king lived roughly as long after the shot as the shot itself took to fire. And the message Imro wanted to send that Macedonian grievances hadn't gone anywhere, Belgrade's South Serb fiction notwithstanding, landed, though not in any way that actually helped the people it claimed to speak for. It rarely does. Then, in April 1941, the whole Yugoslav kingdom collapsed in about 11 days flat under an Axis invasion, which is not a typo 11 days and got carved up like a Sunday roast among Germany, Italy, Hungary and Bulgaria. Bulgaria took the prize it had wanted for decades, most of Vardar Macedonia, formally annexed by mid-May. And here's the part that tends to surprise people. A meaningful chunk of the local population actually welcomed the Bulgarians in. Not because fascism is appealing, it categorically is not, but because after 20 years of being told their language didn't exist, having Bulgarian troops show up and reopen schools that taught in something recognizably close to their own Slavic tongue felt, briefly, like relief. That should tell you everything about how badly Belgrade had mishandled things. The bar was on the floor, and Bulgaria cleared it by inches. The goodwill did not last. It rarely does, with occupations. Bulgarian rule brought forced conscription into the Bulgarian army, requisitioned grain and livestock in a wartime economy that had none to spare, and an administration that turned out to be every bit as intolerant of Macedonian distinctiveness as the Serbs had been, just with different paperwork. Partisan resistance began forming in the hills almost immediately, and by 1943, occupation had curdled fully into resentment. Which brings us, unavoidably, to the darkest chapter in this region's 20th century, and I want to slow down here, because this part deserves to be told properly rather than rushed through. Macedonia had a Jewish community stretching back roughly 450 years, to the Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s who resettled across the Ottoman Balkans and built something lasting. Bitola Monastir, as it was known, held one of the great Sephardic communities of southeastern Europe, with synagogues named Aragon and Portugal, a living Ladino-speaking culture. More than 10,000 people at its peak in the early 1900s. Skopje and Štip had their own thriving communities too. These weren't recent arrivals. These were families who had been baking the same bread, singing the same songs, and burying their dead in the same cemeteries for something like 15 generations. In March of 1943, Bulgarian authorities acting on their own initiative, coordinating with Nazi Germany, rounded up essentially the entire Jewish population of occupied Macedonia. In Skopje, more than 7,000 people were herded into a hastily converted tobacco warehouse, the old monopole factory, and held there for up to 18 days in conditions that were already a kind of slow cruelty before a single train departed. Then, across 3 transports on the 22nd, the 25th, and the 29th of March, 7,144 Macedonian Jews were deported by rail to the Treblinka extermination camp in occupied Poland. Almost none of them came back. Roughly 200 survived the war. A community that had endured for 4.5 centuries was, in the space of about 3 weeks, reduced to a handful of survivors and a scattering of empty buildings. There's a bitter footnote worth sitting with. Bulgaria's own pre-war Jewish population, the Jews who held Bulgarian citizenship inside Bulgaria's old borders, were largely saved thanks to public and clerical pressure that pushed the government to refuse deportation. But the Jews of the new territories, the occupied lands in Macedonia and Thrace that Bulgaria had annexed but never quite considered fully Bulgarian, got no such protection. The government drew a legal line between ours and not quite ours, and an entire community fell on the wrong side of that line and paid for it with their lives. It's the kind of bureaucratic distinction that sounds almost mundane on paper, and is in practice about as morally damning as history gets. Against that backdrop, the communist-led partisan resistance organised under Josip Broz Tito across occupied Yugoslavia kept growing through 1943 and into 1944, and in Macedonia it found real traction among people who'd had quite enough of being told what they were by whichever army currently held the train station. And on the 2nd of August, 1944 deliberately chosen, because that date is Ilinden, the anniversary of the 1903 uprising, and symbolism was absolutely the point. Macedonian partisan delegates gathered secretly at the monastery of St. Prohor-Pichinski, in territory still technically behind occupied lines, and convened something called ASNOM, the Anti-Fascist Assembly for the National Liberation of Macedonia. People at the time called it the Second Ilinden. 41 years after Kruševo's 10 defiant days, somebody was trying again. This time it stuck. ASNOM laid the foundations for a Macedonian state to exist within a future socialist Yugoslav federation, not independent, not yet, but recognised, with a name, a territory, and a government of its own for the first time since medieval Tsar Samuil's empire. And in a move that mattered just as much as any border, the Assembly declared Macedonian an official literary language, to be formally standardised over the following year. This was new. Genuinely new. There had been earlier attempts. A scholar named Krista Mizakov had sketched out the linguistic case decades before, largely ignored in his own lifetime, but 1944 is when it actually happened, with the poet and linguist Blažej Koneski leading the committee that fixed the grammar, mostly drawing on dialects from around Prilep and Bitola. After centuries of other people's empires telling this population what language they were allowed to have, they sat down and wrote their own. By 1945, the Socialist Republic of Macedonia existed formally as one of 6 republics inside Tito's new Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, with Skopje as its capital, the same city that had fallen to Ottoman conquest back in the 1390s, now the seat of government for a country with its own name on the map at last. The following decades were, by the standards of everything that had come before, almost suspiciously calm. Industrialization rolled through, standards of living climbed, Tito's particular brand of non-aligned socialism kept the Republic out of both NATO's and Moscow's direct orbit. and Skopje itself grew into a genuine modern city, which is exactly the kind of sentence that, in this history, tends to precede a disaster. On the 26th of July 1963 at about 5 in the morning, an earthquake measuring roughly 6.1 struck Skopje directly. In under 20 seconds, something like 80% of the city was destroyed. Over 1,000 people were killed, thousands more injured, and more than 200,000 people, most of the city's population, were left homeless, standing in the rubble of a place that had existed in some form for over 2,000 years. It's the kind of number that's genuinely hard to picture, so try this. Imagine your entire town gone in the time it takes to read this sentence aloud. What happened next is, honestly, one of the better stories the Cold War produced. The United Nations coordinated an enormous international relief and reconstruction effort. Aid poured in from both sides of the Iron Curtain simultaneously, which in 1963 was itself close to a minor miracle, and ran a global architectural competition for how to rebuild the city. The winning vision came, in large part, from the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, fresh off rebuilding a very different, devastated city back home. Not all of his master plan got built exactly as drawn, but enough of it did: the sweeping concrete train station, the city wall housing blocks, the whole brutalist skyline that still defines Skopje today, that the rebuilt city earned itself a nickname, the City of Solidarity. Every so often, history remembers to be kind. Tito-era Macedonia settled into a genuine, if imperfect, stability after that Skopje rebuilt, the economy modernizing, a standard of living that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd lived through the Bulgarian occupation. But underneath the calm, one tension kept simmering rather than resolving. The growing ethnic Albanian population concentrated in the west of the Republic, around Tetovo and Gostivar, who had their own language, their own grievances about representation, and their own sense, not entirely unlike the Macedonians' own sense, a generation earlier, of being a recognized minority whose recognition never quite translated into equal weight. Tito, whatever else you want to say about him, was very good at being the adult in the room who kept everybody's grudges from boiling over. Then, on the 4th of May 1980, Tito died, and it turned out an awful lot of Yugoslavia's stability had been less about the system and more about the one specific man running it, because almost immediately, the cracks that had been carefully papered over for 35 years started showing daylight. Economic strain deepened through the 1980s. Nationalist rhetoric, muted for a generation, started creeping back into public life across the Federation. Albanian protests in Macedonia grew louder as unrest spread from neighbouring Kosovo. Nobody had a plan for what came after Tito, which, if you've been paying attention to this region's history at all, should sound extremely familiar. The republic that had finally gotten its name, its language, and its own government was about to find out whether any of that would survive the country it belonged to, falling apart around it. Chapter 6: Independence, the Name War, and the Road to Today. Yugoslavia did not fall apart gently. Slovenia fought a 10-day war and got out relatively cheap. Croatia's war ground on for 4 brutal years. Bosnia became one of the great horrors of the late 20th century, a word Srebrenica that still makes rooms go quiet. Kosovo's turn came at the very end of the decade, with NATO bombers eventually getting involved. So when it was Macedonia's turn to ask Belgrade, politely, whether it could leave, you would have forgiven anyone for assuming this was going to go the same way. It did not. And that fact alone, that one republic managed to walk out of a burning building without setting anything else on fire, deserves to be treated as the small miracle it actually was, rather than a footnote squeezed between the wars everyone remembers. On the 8th of September, 1991, Macedonians went to the polls and were asked, essentially, do you want a sovereign and independent state? One that could still choose to join some future association of Yugoslav states if it ever wanted to. Turnout came in at roughly 76%, and of those who voted, somewhere around 96% said yes. Most ethnic Albanians in the country sat this one out, boycotting over that dangling clause about future Yugoslav alliances, which was an early preview of a grievance that would not go away quietly. Independence was formally declared on the 25th of September, and a new constitution followed that November. No shots fired at the ballot box. Just a very ordinary-looking referendum that happened to end 400 years, give or take, of somebody else running the place. So why did this one go smoothly when the neighbours were busy setting fire to each other? Partly geography, Macedonia bordered no large concentration of Serbs willing to fight to keep it in the fold, unlike Croatia and Bosnia, which both had exactly that problem in spades. Partly leadership, the country's first president, Kiro Gligorov, spent the transition negotiating rather than posturing, and the Yugoslav People's Army actually withdrew from Macedonian territory without a fight, handing over its bases in an orderly fashion that, frankly, nobody in the region had much practice doing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't permanent peace, as we're about to see. But compared to what was happening a few hundred kilometres away, Macedonia's exit from Yugoslavia looked less like a divorce and more like two roommates quietly agreeing the lease was up, which, in Balkan terms, is basically a fairy tale ending. Except the story didn't end there, because independence immediately ran into a problem nobody had fully wargamed. Greece, Macedonia's southern neighbour, home to its own region also called Macedonia, the actual heartland of Alexander the Great's ancient kingdom, looked at this brand new country calling itself the Republic of Macedonia, and got, to put it mildly, extremely upset. The objection ran on three fronts at once. The name itself, which Athens argued implied a claim on Greek territory. The flag, which featured the Vergina sun, a 16-ray gold star dug up from what's believed to be the tomb of Philip II, Alexander's own father, and which Greece considered its cultural property, and language in the new constitution that Greece read as an open door to irredentism. If you remember back in Chapter 2, we flagged the tangled question of who owns ancient Macedon well. Here it is again, except this time it's not academics arguing, it's two governments. The dispute escalated fast enough that by the time the United Nations got around to admitting the country in April of 1993, nobody could agree on what to actually call the new member. So the UN did what committees do when they can't solve a problem. It punted. Macedonia was admitted under the deliberately clunky, deliberately provisional label the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, FYROM for short, a placeholder explicitly described as temporary. Pending a resolution everyone assumed was right around the corner, that temporary label ended up sticking around for a little over 25 years, which is roughly the diplomatic equivalent of putting a sticky note on the fridge that says we'll deal with this Tuesday, and then still finding it there a quarter of a century later, yellowed and half peeled off, nobody quite brave enough to throw it away. Greece didn't stop at strongly worded letters. In 1994, it slapped a unilateral trade embargo on its new neighbour, and for a small landlocked country whose most direct route to the sea ran straight through the Greek port of Thessaloniki, that was not a symbolic gesture, it was a chokehold. Fuel, goods, exports, all of it got squeezed for the better part of a year while the Macedonian economy, already fragile from the collapse of Yugoslav trade networks, absorbed the hit. The embargo finally lifted in 1995 after the two countries signed something called the Interim Accord, which did what interim things in this region always seem to do. It solved the immediate crisis while leaving the actual argument completely, gloriously unresolved. Progress. Balkan style, you fix the symptom, frame the disease, and schedule the real conversation for some vague point in the future. Part of that 1995 deal involved the flag, and I have to say, watching two governments negotiate the precise angle of sunbeams on a national banner is one of those details history hands you for free. Macedonia agreed to drop the Virginia sun and adopt what flies over the country today, a simple red field with a golden sun at the centre, 8 broad rays stretching out to each edge. Adopted in October of 1995, the constitution got amended too, explicitly disavowing any territorial claims on Greek soil, just to remove all doubt. It was, by any measure, a reasonable compromise. It also solved almost nothing about the name itself, which remained exactly as contested as before, just now flying under a flag Greece found slightly less objectionable. Everybody exhaled, nobody actually relaxed. And while the diplomats argued about sun rays and syllables, a different pressure had been quietly building back home for years. The one we already flagged in Tetovo and Gostivar, under Tito, the country's ethnic Albanian population, roughly a quarter of everyone living there, who felt, with real justification, that independence had rearranged the flag and the passport without meaningfully rearranging their access to political power, university education in their own language, or representation in the police and civil service. Grievance doesn't stay quiet forever, especially not with an armed, battle-hardened neighbour next door. Kosovo's own war had just wrapped up in 1999, flooding the region with weapons and combat veterans who suddenly had a lot of free time and very strong opinions. That mixture went off in January of 2001, a newly formed insurgent group calling itself the National Liberation Army, drawing heavily on Kosovo Liberation Army veterans and volunteers from the Kruševo Valley, began attacking Macedonian security forces in the country's northwest, centred around Tetovo. What followed was 7 or 8 months of genuine armed conflict ambushes, shelling, villages emptied, government forces and NLA fighters trading fire in the hills above a city that, 20 years earlier, had just been a name on Tito's list of simmering tensions. It never fully tipped into the kind of full-blown civil war that had consumed Bosnia, but for those months, it was close enough that plenty of people who'd watched the 1990s unfold elsewhere in the region assumed they knew exactly how this story was going to end. It didn't end that way, and the reason is worth naming, because it's rare enough in this history to count as good news. On the 13th of August 2001, with NATO and the European Union leaning hard on both sides to get to a table, Macedonian and ethnic Albanian representatives signed the Ohrid Framework Agreement. Albanian became an official second language in areas where the population warranted it. Government hiring, policing, and public administration were reworked to be more proportionally representative. Power was decentralized toward local municipalities. In exchange, the Albanian side gave up separatist demands and recognized Macedonian institutions outright, and NATO troops moved in under an operation with the almost comically wholesome name Essential Harvest to physically collect weapons from the disbanding NLA. Imperfect, contested, still debated today, but it held. The war that could have happened didn't. So Macedonia had now survived its own independence, survived a trade embargo, survived an armed insurgency, and it still couldn't get its own name approved on a UN letterhead. The 2000s and 2010s ground on with the dispute essentially frozen in amber Macedonia, meeting every technical requirement, NATO asked of it, and Greece blocking the door anyway. The low point came at NATO's Bucharest summit in 2008, where Greece formally vetoed Macedonia's invitation to join the alliance, specifically and explicitly over the name. An international court later ruled Greece had actually breached its own 1995 commitments by doing that. It didn't matter much in practice. You can win a legal argument and still be locked out of the club, which is a special kind of frustrating that most of us have felt at least once, just usually with lower geopolitical stakes. The breakthrough, when it finally came from two men willing to spend real political capital on a problem their predecessors had spent decades kicking down the road. In June of 2018, Macedonian Prime Minister Zoran Zaev and Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras signed the Prespa Agreement, named for the lake straddling their shared border. The deal: Macedonia would rename itself the Republic of North Macedonia, permanently, constitutionally. In return, Greece would drop every objection to its neighbour joining NATO and the European Union. It was elegant on paper and genuinely painful in practice, because naming disputes touch identity in a way trade tariffs never do, and both governments knew they were about to spend a great deal of goodwill they didn't necessarily have to spare. It was not a clean, popular, everybody claps ratification. A Macedonian referendum that September saw over 90% support the deal, but turnout landed around 37%. Short of the threshold needed to make it formally binding, so Zaev pushed the change through Parliament instead, scraping past with a bare supermajority after some opposition lawmakers crossed the floor. In Greece, the vote was even tighter, passing by a margin of roughly 153 votes to 146, against a backdrop of enormous street protests in Athens and Thessaloniki from Greeks who felt Macedonia, with or without North, bolted onto the front, should never belong to anyone else. Nobody involved got a tidy, satisfying win. What they got was a deal that mostly worked, which in this particular argument counted as a genuine breakthrough. The Prespa Agreement formally entered into force on the 12th of February 2019, and just like that, after nearly 28 years of provisional labels, court cases, embargoes, and one very contested flag, the country finally had a name that was entirely, unambiguously its own: the Republic of North Macedonia. Agreed, signed, filed, done. A little over a year later, on the 27th of March 2020, it walked through the door. Greece had spent a decade holding shut and became NATO's 30th member state. European Union accession talks got the formal green light around the same time, though because this region rarely lets a happy ending go entirely uncomplicated, a separate dispute with Bulgaria, over shared history, language and minority rights, has kept full EU membership tantalisingly out of reach ever since. Some arguments in this part of the world, it seems, are simply never quite finished. And that, more or less, brings us up to now, a small landlocked stretch of mountains and lake country that has, over roughly 3,000 years, belonged to the Paeonians, then Alexander's Macedon, then Rome, then Byzantium, then a Bulgarian Empire, then a Serbian one, then 4 centuries under the Ottomans, then Yugoslavia in several different shapes, and only quite recently, only within living memory for plenty of the people who live there now, got to sit down and choose its own name for itself. Every single other name on that long list was handed down by somebody else, usually with an army standing nearby to make the point stick. This one they picked. That's not a small thing, even if it took a UN placeholder and a lakeside handshake to get there. So if you've made it this far, thank you for spending these 6 chapters in Macedonia with me through Paeonian herders and Roman roads, through Ilinden's 10 defiant days and a king shot dead in Marseille, through an earthquake that flattened a capital and a community lost to Treblinka that should never be forgotten, all the way to a red flag with a golden sun finally flying over a country that gets to answer, in its own words, the question it spent thousands of years being asked by everyone else. Who are you? Wherever you're listening from, however far along into sleep you already are, I hope this one travelled well with you. Rest easy. I'll see you in the next one.